Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world today. My name is Sarah, and I will be hosting this webinar today. So just before we begin, I was wondering if people can please write in the chat box, where are you listening to us from? It kind of helps me check if everything is working okay. When you write, please make sure to write to all panelists and attendees, so that way in the little drop-down box, you can make sure that everyone sees where you're from. So I can already see we have people here from France, Morocco, Colombia, India, Philippines, Russia, Pakistan, Denmark. Incredible. Fantastic. So I'm just checking. I think we're going to wait another minute and then we're going to get started.
We humans, we love to learn. We've got the hands, feet, ears, eyes, mouth, nose, and brain to figure out what works and what doesn't work from the world around us. It's instinctive, it's natural, and it works. So why not learn business this way? The secret to building the skills employers actually want is practice. Practice, practice, practice. So why not start in the classroom? At Hult, we take the theory, the research, the expertise, and we put the challenge into your hands so you find out what happens for yourself. We're not just about what sticks in your brain, but how you flex it. Because real life is not found on an exam. And with career coaching, there's no way you're not hitting your goals. Thanks, coach. Graduation, it's more than finals. You'll have a proven skill set from working on real-world business challenges so you can smash any interview and make an impact on the job from day one. Because grades alone don't show who you really are. P.S. With campuses around the world, you're about to go global. There are a lot of places where you can learn about the business world. There aren't many places where you can live it. To learn business, you've got to do business. Makes sense, doesn't it? Hult, for those made to do.
So again, hello and welcome everyone to Hult's Virtual Skills Lab. This forum is an online global meeting space offering you the opportunity to skill up and get ahead directly from your home. You can connect with like-minded go-getters from all over the globe and hear from world-class Hult professors on the latest topics and trends in live interactive workshops and webinars. So for those of you here who are joining a Hult event for the first time, I just want to give you a little bit of background about us. Hult has designed a business school that looks to the future by focusing on developing your leadership skills, challenging you with a future-oriented curriculum, and building a global perspective that only first-hand experience can actually bring you. From our undergraduate programs through to specialized masters, full-time MBAs, part-time MBAs, as well as live online options, we really bring together creative, open-minded people from all over the world to do business and not just to study it. So Hult is truly made for those to do. For more information on our programs and the upcoming scholarship deadline, you can simply go to hult.edu. So today, as you can see, we are joined by Hult Professor Cari Guittard to explore the topic of strategic influence and persuasion globally. So before we begin, I would like to do a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, a recording of this webinar will be sent out to everyone through email in the next few days. So no worries, you're going to have the full recording afterwards in your inbox. So the masterclass will approximately last 45 minutes, including questions. So please make sure to write your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat, because this makes it easier for us to answer them at the end of the class. So now I'm very happy to hand over to Professor Guittard.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone. It's so great to be with you and to see so many countries represented. I mean, it's just amazing. We've got Denmark, South Africa, Philippines, India, Saudi, Iraq, Russia, Nigeria, Estonia, Colombia. I mean, where else can you just immediately step into a global community other than Hult? I mean, this is why I teach at Hult. This is why I love the Hult culture and the Hult family, especially with everything going on in the world today. So I just want to welcome all of you. I'm in the Bay Area right now. It's cold and foggy today, and I just want everybody to take a moment, because I know we all sign up for a lot of webinars and different things, and you all have packed busy schedules. I just want you to put down whatever you're doing. Put down your phones, put down your laptops, your smart devices, whatever you have, your pens. And I just want you to close your eyes. Just bear with me. Take a deep breath in. Hold it for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let that out. And I want you to let everything else go and just come into this space with us. The reason I want you to just kind of have this mini reset is because I want you to be intentional about our time together. It's a very short amount of time, and I want this to be as practical and as useful to you as possible, to get as much insight as possible and questions answered. And we're going to have a lot of Q&A time as well throughout this session. So I do hope you brought with you, I always have with me, my students know this as well, to always come prepared with a notepad and a pen. And so as we go forward, you know, even though we're focusing on persuasion and influence, this webinar is all about you and what you're curious about and interested in. So be writing down questions or things that stand out. And if I'm not able to address them in our session today, I'm going to be sharing my contact information. So you can certainly reach out to me afterwards with additional questions, and I'm happy to answer those and to stay in touch. So let me just share my screen because I did prepare a few slides, and we're going to do sort of a mini preview of one of the classes that I teach on any given year. And it's one of my favorites because I've spent my career really working with amazing brand builders and people who really are amazing storytellers, and they know persuasion and influence inside and out. And so they really shaped my perspective on influence and persuasion. Can everybody, are we good, Sarah, on the slides? Can you see my slides?
Yes, we're all good.
Oh, excellent. Cool. Okay. So before we get into some of my favorite nuggets from that course that I teach, I wanted to share with you just some of the other courses that I cover on any given year. Professors, we teach different courses. It depends on the year. It depends on what's happening, you know, as far as curriculum and the student interest. But I typically get to see students at 2 critical points: at the very beginning of your Hult journey and at the very end, right before you graduate. So it's fun for me because I get to see the whole transformation. But at the beginning, I typically teach on the San Francisco campus core leadership components. And it's really an extraordinary time because that's when everybody comes together, and it's such a global immersion, right? And it's very experiential, and everybody's learning from one another and getting to know one another and how to better relate cross-culturally. But also it's about really going inward and trying to figure out what your leadership journey is going to look like. And so that is where I typically start the year with Hult students. And then the other courses that I teach really mirror where my career has taken. And I'm an unusual professor in that I spend about 1/3 of my time on average teaching. The rest of my time is working with startups all over the world, as well as my own consultancy practice that I've had in the purpose space. So helping large global organizations really scale their purpose and social impact efforts. I also do a fair amount of crisis management work, which right now, and especially in the last few years, has been top of mind, I think, for everyone. But for me, it's always been inconsistent in my career, as well as futures work. So looking 10 years out, where can we be thinking about our business and where we want to be 10 years from now? And so it's a very different kind of thinking. It's a very different skill set. And then some other courses that I teach that vary. I originally started on the Dubai campus, so I spent quite a bit of my early career in the Middle East. It's a region I have just a deep closeness with because I spent so much time there. I worked for the State Department, and I started my career in cybersecurity. So I spent a lot of time in technology and security spaces and doing geopolitical risk. So corporate diplomacy and geopolitical risk is one of my favorite courses. And especially now, when you think about everything happening in the world, we need business leaders and different kinds of leaders, I would argue, to step in and step up and solve problems where governments and political leadership has failed. And we don't need to look any further than the headlines that have been, hitting us every day just this week, right? With what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. And so to be knowledgeable about the world and what's happening and how that could impact businesses, supply chains, civilians, that's hugely critical. But the other thing too is, what are you going to do about it? Where can you bring your best talents and skill sets into that mix and develop solutions that can be both a business opportunity, but also something that helps humanity, right? And we're able to move forward and problem solve in very different, unique ways. And that's what I think is just so awesome about working in a business school environment and then working with the private sector and companies, as opposed to governments, which I've also worked with. You're just able to be more creative and do some extraordinary things where governments can't. So the other areas that I do love to teach as well are gender intelligence and diversity, equity, and inclusion, which also have been very top of mind. And it's exciting to finally see companies really focused on this and getting this right. And how do we do this better? And this is something that, of course, in a global classroom with 80 nationalities, we have a lot of fun with. Like, what does this actually mean? And how can we build better working relationships and communicate more effectively? And the gender intelligence course, which is near and dear to me, I actually developed it for the Dubai campus initially. And I designed it for men, women, and everyone in between to be in the same room together, to be vulnerable, ask questions, and really, be able to get a deeper understanding of one another and be able to work more effectively together. And so it's a really powerful class where we all come together and we just have very frank, open, honest discussions. And we learn some practical tools for how we can take that then into the workplace. So, and then of course I teach strategic influence and persuasion. And so today, I'm really curious, and I hope you'll share some of your thoughts in the chat, but where do you most want to level up your persuasion skills? I mean, you signed up for this webinar. Maybe you signed up because the title intrigued you. Maybe you signed up because you were curious about Hult. But if you think about persuasion influence, and I'm talking to the introverts here because I'm an introvert, and my happy place is with my books. As you can see, this is my home office surrounded by books. Anybody can learn to persuade and influence more effectively. And it's essential for life. And it's absolutely critical for business. And then we want you to be able to lead. And this is what Hult specializes in. We launch leaders. We want you to be able to step into whatever space you want to lead in and be effective. I see a hand raised. Sarah, did someone have something they want to share?
Too. I think the easiest would be to please write in the chat your answers so the professor can read them out loud.
That would be awesome. I actually can't see the chat, Sarah. Can you help me out and read that for me when they pop up?
Of course. I think we're still waiting for people to write something. But yeah, please don't be shy, guys. This is your opportunity.
Don't be shy, because if you were in my class, whether you were on Zoom in my class or in the actual physical space, people are jumping in and asking questions and engaging. And that's how I love engaging with you. So yes, please do not be shy. But I'm really what I'm trying to get at is, can we be intentional about the areas that are challenging for us, right? And when it comes to persuasion, it could be in your writing, it can be in your public speaking, it can be how you persuade over Zoom or any other video format. So that there's a huge range. Did a couple pop up?
So I'm seeing a few. The first one is pitching for new business, as well as persuasion in professional environment.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. So the pitching for new business, we spend a lot of time on that. And in fact, I work with so many entrepreneurs as well who are pitching for investment, funding. And so this is an area that the more you practice it, the better you get at it. And it's also too where we break down, especially in this course, all the elements of persuasion and persuasion. So before you even open your mouth, before you even start conveying whatever your pitch is, especially if you're trying to bring in new clients, expand your business, bring in new strategic partnerships, or even go for funding, right? It's a series of different very isolated moments that have collective impact on your audience. And so we almost work the process backwards of what are we trying to achieve? And then how can we achieve that and really become effective in it? And so it's really fascinating to do that, especially when English may not be your first, your primary language, and to figure out your pacing, your body language, your tone, all these things that come together, as well as the elements of the presentation itself. And what I find is, so I give on average about 100 speeches a year. So I'm doing this all the time, right? And again, I was sharing with all of you that I'm an introvert, so it takes a tremendous amount of energy for me to do this. And I have a very discrete sort of process that I share with my students for how I prepare. I have it's the same preparation sequence every time, but it's so involved that when I go into the room or into the Zoom room to present or to pitch, I don't need slides. I don't need data. I have it all ready to go off the cuff, because the most important thing whenever you're pitching, it doesn't matter what the goal is the relationship to the other human being. It's your ability to develop that social capital, that trust instantly. Can they trust you? Should they trust you? Why should they listen to you? That's what you have to get at. And that's the essence of persuasion and influence, and ultimately leadership. So it's an excellent question. And this is one that I love unpacking at a deeper level. And then we practice and we pitch constantly, and we bring in real world clients so you can pitch clients. And in fact, the Future Mindset Capstone is going on right now, and we have a real world client, and they're going to be pitched to several times during the process of the capstone project. So it's just this ever evolving iterative process of practicing, refining, practicing, refining, so that by the time you graduate, you just have a whole new set of the tool set really to draw upon, to kind of expand your presentation and influencing skills. Excellent question. Was there one more that I could address, Sarah, that popped up that stood out to you?
I don't really think it's a question yet, but someone said persuasion for crisis management and persuasion in legal environment.
So those are excellent as well. Very different environments. On the crisis management side, for sure, it's one of those areas where the stakes are so much higher, because you have everybody's running on adrenaline, right? You have very shortened and compressed time frames. The other thing too is just from a neuroscience perspective, everyone's in fight or flight mode. So you're managing emotions, you're managing behaviors, you're managing just this wide range in a very compressed amount of time. I actually really enjoy that space, but not everybody does. And so if that's your interest area, feel free to reach out to me afterwards. I'm happy to share more resources in that space, but we really get into that in depth in the elective. And then on the legal side, so persuading and influencing from a legal perspective is fascinating to me, in part because I have so many lawyers in my family. And we also have a lot of Hult students who are lawyers who end up coming back in to get their MBAs. And that is a really powerful combination. And persuading in the legal environment is different for a number of reasons, but one that stands out to me the most is in written communication. And that is an area most people completely forget when it comes to persuasion and influence. And yet we spend the majority of our day, right, sending emails, drafting memos, texting, these sorts of things in a business environment that have that cumulative impact from a persuasion standpoint. But oftentimes we don't think about those skill sets. So we spend a good amount of time really getting into that area of persuasion influence as well, that the lawyers in my classes always really appreciate, because you're taught a certain way to write in law school and to think. And it's not just in law school, any of the schools that you've been to, right? In your formative educational experience, you're taught a certain way of approaching everything. And when you're in the Hult environment, we flip all of that upside down. We ask you to question all of your assumptions and break bad habits and look at learning from a completely different lens. Can you wonder what if, or could we try it this way? Can you bring in different perspectives from, all over the world and maybe come up with different approaches? And so those are the things that I most love unlocking in the classroom. And from a persuasion influence standpoint, there's just so much there that you can leverage. And it's really, really fun once you get into it. It's also challenging as well to manage. So excellent questions. I wanted to just start with some essential definitions because especially when you have so many people from all over the world speaking different languages and having different cultural contexts, I always like to get us all on the same page. So when we're speaking about persuasion, what we're really talking about is the act of causing people to do or believe something, right? It's the act or activity of persuading others. It's something we do. And influence is something that we build over time. It's that capacity to have an effect, right, on the character development or behavior of someone else or something. So this is something that we cultivate, that we nurture, and it takes time. Influence is something that is really, you have to continually nurture. It's not something that you can force. And it gets back to that whole notion of trust, and it's built slowly over time. And I love this quote because especially with everything in our world being so fast paced and everybody, especially with social media, everybody giving you instant sort of approval or gratification. With influence, real influence, that takes time, and that takes a tremendous amount of intention and energy. And so one of the things that I really enjoy working with my students on is how do we most effectively and strategically build and then nurture our social capital, because that will make all the difference in your career. Not only the choices that you're going to have and the opportunities, but I really feel it just makes all the difference in the richness of your experiences, right? And the relationships that you have. And there's no other school. And I've guest lectured at almost all the top business schools. I've been affiliated with other business schools where I've, co-taught and done different things. And I've never found an environment quite like Hult from a social capital perspective. It's the most valuable thing you come out of when you graduate from Hult. You're instantly part of this extraordinary global family. So no matter where you go in the world, you find alum, and it's just, you instantly get each other. And that is the coolest feeling ever, because you see the world through that global lens, right? So that social capital is just incredibly, incredibly valuable. And this is something that, you work to nurture throughout your time at Hult and then also going forward. But in order to improve anything, right, we have to practice. And this is something that in the classroom we are doing constantly, and not just in the classroom, but also out in the field. So I loved that the promo was talking about practicing, because you have to really get into it, to feel it, to understand it, and to also challenge yourself. And so it's not just about rotating to the different global campuses, but you're actually out in the business community. So for example, one of the things I love doing here in the Bay Area is introducing my students and bringing them into companies all over, not just Silicon Valley, but I'm married to a fifth generation chocolate maker. So we spend a lot of time with, other people chefs and people who are in the food industry or agriculture. And it's such a dynamic an amazing, space for the students to explore and to be exposed to that they wouldn't normally if they weren't here in the Bay Area. And that happens on all of our global campuses. So the thing about persuasion influence that frustrates people is that you have to keep practicing this, especially those of us who are introverted more naturally, and we get anxiety from it. So I thought I would share with you just some of my favorite takeaways from all the years of my own work in this space, as well as some lessons from the legends that I've had the opportunity to work with. And then we'll kick it open to Q&A. But fundamentally, persuasion influence as well as leadership comes down to knowing your values and being very specific about what those values are, and then combining that with your passion and purpose, whatever is driving you. And then the final piece that brings it all together is your unique point of view. So that brings in all the elements, all the experiences, all the things that you've had throughout your life. It all comes together into your perspective on whatever that is, right? And so this combination, when you bring it together and you're very clear about what these areas are for you and you're able to articulate it, that is naturally persuasive and influential. The thing that I find shift as your priorities change. They shift as you start your own families or you embark on, different stages in your own lives. On the passion and purpose front, I'm passionate about a lot of things. I'm an insatiable learner. There's just so many things I don't know, and that I want to keep learning, right? But my purpose is really where my strengths, my skill sets align with the world's greatest need. That was a really fascinating. I love that definition of a calling. But it's looking at where is the greatest need? Where can I make the greatest difference? And where do I feel that energy, that drive come alive? And so for my students, it's fascinating because a lot of times they come into the MBA journey and they want to rush through it and just get the credential. And I try and encourage them to slow it down and to go inward, to explore different areas that you might not have explored to this point. I get a lot of students who up until this point in their lives have done everything their parents or their community have expected of them. They became engineers, they became lawyers, they became physicians, whatever it is. But they never took the time to go, what am I curious about? What do I find fascinating or want to explore more or play around with? And so this is the time to do that. And the reason this work is so important, not only from an influence and persuasion and leadership perspective, but this is what gives you that inner drive when you're working in very complex, demanding, stressful environments, which all of us are in, especially in this post-pandemic or still in this pandemic environment, right? It makes all the difference, right? This is what energizes you and fuels you. So we unpack that and we really isolate what that is, and then we practice articulating it. And this is a fun thing because for a lot of us, especially those of us who are introverted or from cultures who are more reserved, this can feel, very humbling and a very unusual experience to be sharing something that's so deeply personal. But the reason it's important is because that's something that, first of all, makes you unique, but it's also something that's immediately relatable to others. And so you practice sharing that and articulating that. The other thing too is that there are a number of blind spots and barriers to how we persuade and influence. And so what's fun is in this very global environment, these are the four most common that I see. But whenever I see something as a potential barrier, I then flip it and look at, okay, how could this be an opportunity? And how can we use this as a moment to learn more about one another or to question our own assumptions? And so we break down all of these different elements. And this part too is really fascinating because once you practice doing it in a classroom environment, then when you take that into the business world, you're able to work with anyone, relate, to anyone in any environment and do it very quickly. And that's incredibly powerful. And then finally, I say that the bunkers this is a barrier that comes from within. These are assumptions that maybe we've been told our whole lives. Oh, well, you're not a good storyteller, or maybe this is not an area for you because you're so quiet or you're not used to speaking or this, that, and the other. And the reality is that anybody can become better at influencing and persuading. It really comes down to unlocking a few elements within ourselves of where our strengths lie, because the truth is some of us are going to be more persuasive in our writing than we are in public speaking. Everybody's going to have different, areas that they're going to be their wheelhouses. But we have to get over that internal bunker where we just go, no, that's not me. I could never do this. You absolutely can. And what's fun is that I pull everyone into these different areas so that everybody can improve. And then you can decide for yourself which areas you want to continue to build on, right? I even have a whole session just for the introverts where I bring the introverts into a separate session and we talk through some of these things and we play with some of these tools, especially those of you with tech backgrounds, because there's nothing more powerful than somebody who has a very technical or analytical or engineering background, and they bring in those communication and persuasion skills. But too often, you've been pigeonholed into one area and you haven't had the opportunity to explore or practice or even develop those other persuasion and influence skill sets. And so this is where, when you bring that together with some of those more technical skills, it's incredibly powerful and persuasive. So these are some of the foundational elements. And this is, once you get that foundation very clear and you're able to articulate that, then you're able to speak and write with a very authentic passion that comes through in everything that you do. And that is something people naturally will gravitate towards. And it comes through in a presentation, it comes through in any pitch. And that's a hard thing to fake. It's just something that comes out of you naturally once you've done all of this work. So I also wanted to share with you just 3 elements when it comes to practical tools that I work with my students on developing. And one, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but it was on the point of view. And why this is so important is because I think so often we don't take the time to see or really kind of lay out, well, how do I see this differently than other people? And the reason that's so important is because of, I look at ROI a bit differently. So our economics and accounting professors give me a hard time for this, but I see ROI to mean, and this definition came from an advertising CEO that I worked with for many years. He's a legend in the branding, global branding space. But to him, ROI meant relevance, originality, and impact. Am I being relevant to my audience? Am I looking at this maybe a little bit differently or questioning assumptions? And how am I leaving impact? How am I leaving the 1 or 2 nuggets where they will remember what I was sharing with them? And they will also be curious enough to want to learn more after I've left that moment of persuasion and influence. So I spend a lot of time really walking my students through this process, because this process of developing your point of view and the ROI together, those are things that I do before I go into any influence situation, whether it's one-to-one over coffee, whether it's an interview, whether it's a pitch. It doesn't matter what the situation is. I go through the same process, and it's very intentional. And why this is so important is when you think about your audience in this way, and you're looking at it through the lens of what's going to be relevant to them, and how can I really hone my own point of view and perspective to be different, to help unlock a different approach or a different way of thinking. That's when you spark trust. That's when you start building relationship with someone. And it's, once that starts happening, it's extraordinary, right? You're able to work more quickly together. You get each other, and it just flows more naturally. And I know all of you have experienced this, right? So this is sort of the formula that we unpack and that we use and we practice consistently, so that over time it becomes second nature. So as far as resources going forward, if this is a space that's of interest to any of you, I had to share sort of Dr. Cialdini's influence in the psychology of persuasion. Any of you who've been in this space or who are in sales are probably already familiar with this, because it's a seminal work. The reason it's seminal, outside the fact that Warren Buffett has given thousands of copies out and really kind of put Robert on the map, but it's because these are very simple, basic kind of laws, if you will, of persuasion and understanding human behavior. So that's sort of required reading for anybody who wants to get better at, in particular, if you're selling or if you're negotiating on the daily. You will absolutely love it if you haven't already dug into this, and you'll recognize it right off the bat. But I find it of value for absolutely everyone. The other thing about Bob's work that most people aren't as familiar with is the follow-up book that he wrote called Presuasion. And so I wanted to recommend that as well if you do get into this space, because Presuasion is all of the elements of persuasion before you walk into the room. So the way he kind of susses out very specific and practical ways of honing your persuasion capabilities, your ability to prepare for that persuasion moment. It's absolutely fascinating. And it's just very easy to read. It's not one of those books that I don't bring any book into the classroom or recommend any books that aren't fun to read and also incredibly practical, because otherwise it's a waste of your time and you're never going to read it. So this is not about theory. This is chock full of his field research, and you'll recognize it, especially those of you who persuade and really love to get into this space. But there's value for all of us in both of these books and his tools that he's developed. So the last thing that I wanted to just say on the persuasion influence front, and it's probably my favorite practical tip because it's counterintuitive, as most things are in global business. But if you really want to get influence, you give it. And this is one of the laws of persuasion that Cialdini underscores, which is the rule of reciprocity, which is you give first before you get. And there's something too just innately gratifying about giving influence constantly, whether you're recommending a colleague or a peer on LinkedIn, or you're sharing someone else's work and giving them praise for their work, whether you take the time to reach out to a colleague, a friend, a family member, to just thank them and to just show your appreciation, and to do that in front of others, giving them influence. When you do that, that makes you more influential. So every time you think of a situation where, you know what, I want to be able to influence this decision maker, or I want to be able to influence, in this particular moment in time, say it's a pitch or whatever, think, before I walk into this moment, how can I give influence to the audience member that I'm trying to persuade? And if you can start laying that groundwork, you're going to walk in such a better footing and instantly better be able to relate and build trust when you do that. But that takes humility, right? That takes intention, forethought, and really taking time to think about that individual and the influence that you want to give. But I've just found that once you start doing this too regularly, it becomes habitual. And it's really gratifying to see other people go, wow, thanks, you appreciate my work. I had no idea. So I do this all the time, every single day. It's a habit of mine that I really practice, and it makes all the difference from an influence and persuasion perspective. So I just want to open it up now. I know I just rushed through a lot of those pieces, but I wanted to get to the Q&A so we could have ample time for Q&A. We can talk about some of the points that I raised. We can talk about any of the other courses I mentioned, or we can talk about the Hult journey, or just having a global career as well. It's wide open.
So first of all, thank you so much, Professor. Yes, I want to encourage you to please post your questions in the Q&A box about persuasion and influence. So I think we have a first question from Laura. She says, any advice or theory for someone with a tech background to practice persuasion, especially in a tech environment where people are a little bit more stiff in their communication?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So the Masters of Business Analytics is a fantastic program. And in fact, when I have their cohort in leadership classes, we actually do a ton of this work. And part of this work, and so most of them are very technical in their backgrounds, also very introverted naturally. This is not their happy space. They get very uncomfortable. But I think one of the ways that you can start becoming more comfortable, and this seems very simple, right? And a lot of these things are simple, but you just have to practice them. So outside of being in a business school environment, which is, I think, one of the best to practice, because you're practicing in a very global environment and you get to learn from one another as well as practice these tools. At home, one of the things that you can do, especially if you want to become better at, say, public speaking, for example, is read poetry aloud. I love poetry. Poetry and philosophy are two areas that I really value because they help us unlock the other side of our brain. I spend a lot of time in the left side of my brain, very thinking. I do deeply appreciate the creative side, and I work with a lot of creative people. Poetry and philosophy help you unlock that other creative side. But when you read poetry out loud, it helps you practice your pacing, your timing, right? And so it's a very valuable kind of tool of just helping you find tone, rhythm, in how you speak, and especially if English is not your first language. So that's one. Another tool that I love sharing when it comes to developing your point of view and your ROI before you go into that influencing moment where you're going to be speaking, or before you write. This is why I always have a notepad and pen. I'm writing it down. I'm thinking through, what are the arguments that I want to make? What are the core elements that I want to convey? And then I cut that by a third, because most people cannot absorb all the wonderful arguments that you want to share and make. And so I go, okay, out of these 3 or 4 things, what is the core thing I want them to take away? And then come back to me for these other elements. And so I really like to outline and work through that before I start any communication. So those 2 things are small things that every day you can practice. And a lot of people are like, oh, I don't have time to write things down and to take notes and to try and do outlines. And yes, you do. Sometimes it'll take no more than 5 minutes. But the reason it's so powerful is when you take pen to paper, you have greater blood flow across the entirety of the brain. You have greater recall of information that you've been collecting and learning throughout your lifetime when you're writing, not when you're typing, but when you're writing. And you're more creative because you have to make choices for the information. So the brain is in a very different operating mode, if you will, when you're taking pen to paper. So I actually force my students, they get very annoyed at the beginning of when we start this in their Hult journey. But by the end of it, they're like, I'm so glad you told me how to do this. You made me do this, because it also helps your memory. But even for us technical types, writing down our thoughts, it makes us better speakers. It makes us better able to articulate our thoughts because we've taken the time to write it down and to organize our thoughts. It also eases our anxiety for those of you who get anxiety when you have to present or be on point, or and then it really hones your memory. So excellent question. I see a question
Amazing.
from, is it Ida?
Yeah, so we have a question that I personally think is super interesting. What's the difference for you between influence and persuasion?
So to me, so we're all persuading every day. It's something we do. Like, I mean, we literally are persuading every single day. I'm a parent. I have 2 small children. I'm constantly persuading them to try and do what I ask them to do. The little one wants to fight me on everything, as well as in business, right? The more formal ways we're persuading. But in the small ways, we're persuading all day long, every day. We don't really think about it unless we're in that business environment and it's a very formal construct. So for me, persuasion, right? It's that what we do. And it's, I come from a family that my family, they're storytellers. That's what we used to do as a kid. We would all get together and tell great stories, and we argue politics. And I love that. So we all had to be paying attention to what was happening in the world and learn how to be great storytellers. And for those of you who did that and at your family dinner table or do it now, that is one of the best skill sets, right? You can develop. But that's persuasion. That's learning how to persuade in the moment, day to day, right? That's persuasion. That's one skill set base. Influence, that's a bit trickier. Influence is more, and I've come to appreciate it more as my career has evolved, especially as I stepped into more and more leadership roles. Influence is really tricky because influence is really about situational awareness, understanding your environment, reading your environment and responding accordingly, and then engaging with people appropriately and respectfully, and being able to do it with people who are very different from you, to build trust, and then over time to nurture that trust, and to do it with people in every environment, across sectors, across industries. So influence to me is, I think sometimes people don't spend enough time being intentional about it. So I actually walk my students through, okay, strategically, if you look at your social capital, how could you expand your social capital in a way that you can develop the influence over time that's going to give you the career that you're most going to be proud of, right? Where you feel you're able to have the greatest impact, okay? And oftentimes, nobody spends any time really thinking about how you do this, right? But when you start being more intentional about your influence, and especially as an introvert, you become more intentional about who you give your energy to. because I used to give my energy to anybody, everybody all day long, and I was exhausted at the end of the day. You can't sustain that, especially when you feel like you're in constant crisis mode, which is what most of us have been feeling with the pandemic and everything else happening geopolitically. So influence is something that's a different skill set. It's a different tool set. And so at Hult, what's super cool is that you have this global family baked in, and you have this peer group where in the classroom, especially, what I love is I'm not standing up at the front of the room lecturing to you. I am in the room with you and I'm learning from you. And my job is to provoke and to push you and to get you to challenge one another so that you learn that process of, okay, we can think differently. We can approach problem solving differently, but we can still be respectful. We can still nurture that relationship. We can still build trust. And then once you have that foundation, then, okay, this is how you influence. And so the more you do that, it starts to become second nature, so that when you go off into the world after being in that environment, I mean, you're able then to influence in a very different way, and in a way that best serves you and what you want to do in your career and in your life. And that's super cool. And but again, it's a different skill set, and that's a lot of emotional agility and emotional intelligence, which is not a comfortable space for everyone, especially the very technical types. But once we start unpacking it and they start getting into it, they're like, oh my gosh, this is so fun. Because it is fun. It should be fun. And there's just so much that all of us can improve. Nobody is an expert in this space. So excellent question. Okay, there's
amazing. Yeah, I think to what you said, I was actually a student myself at Hult years ago, and I can say that like what you just said is, I think, one of the #1 skills that you actually take away from the program. So very interesting. We actually have a few questions in the chat now, but I see that we have someone who has raised his or her hand. Amit, are you ready to ask your question? You can just unmute yourself if you want, or type it in the chat, whatever you prefer. Okay, I think in that case, let's move on to another question that I think is very, very interesting. The question was, sometimes I come across people who feel that persuasion is the same as manipulation. How do you think we can change this point of view?
Is that Gemma? It's a Gemma, excellent.
Exactly.
Amazing question. Yeah. And in fact, if you email me, I'm going to share my email at the end, but on LinkedIn, I can certainly, I've got a fantastic article, which is the dark side of persuasion influence. So we go into that, right? And that's an ethical consideration. And what's really fascinating is that's a different ethical and moral line, depending on where you are in the world, depending on your experiences, depending on, your point of view on a number of issues, right? And so one of the things that we kind of start this space off with is, I always say, please use your powers for good, not evil, because they can be used for manipulation. Absolutely. They're used every day for manipulation. They're used for certain sales tactics. Algorithms are designed, right, to best capitalize on that manipulation by leveraging some of these rules and principles of persuasion. So it is absolutely part of that, right? But it's one of those things where if you are genuine about your intent, manipulation to me is where your intent is to take something from someone or to destroy something, right? Or to break something down. You have that intent, not of bringing something together and creating something positive. That's always going to be a part of humanity. You're always going to have people in the world who are like that. But the reality is that if you want to lead, all great leaders know how to persuade and influence. And it is an essential component of leadership. And why you have to learn it, why you should dedicate time to learning it, outside the fact that I want you to be successful in life, and you can't find a mate. I want all of you to have mates, to have partners in life where you feel love and joy, and right. That's persuasion. So the species wouldn't survive if we didn't know how to persuade and influence at that basic, sort of primal level. But at a larger macro level, look, we don't have enough leaders in the world. who have good intentions, who really want to better society and solve problems for society and advance humanity. And that's why I teach, because I am concerned about my children and the leaders they're going to be working for and watching and emulating. And I've seen this direction going with global leaders, and not just political, but also in business too, that are just the antithesis of really kind of the core values I was raised on, which is so much about, we are a global community and how we should really honor, respect, and take care of one another and do that, to each of our best abilities. And so to lead at the highest level, whatever that is, in business, in government, in nonprofits, you have to have several layers up of skill set in this area. And so that's where I think, especially in technology, because technology is moving so fast, we do not have enough people with the technical skills and the persuasion and influence skills to lead in that space. And that makes me really worried. I can find people with the credentials, the certifications on the technical side. Finding people with technical skills, that's easy. Finding an engineer, that's easy. A lawyer, easy. But somebody who can take their technical skill sets, combine that with the ability to persuade and communicate effectively, plus global social capital, that right there, you can basically decide which area in the world you want to have a positive impact, and you will make an impact. And so that's the thing that, I try and help each of my students. The thing that's really unusual too, that I appreciate about Hult, that most of my students are sort of surprised by, but you have a very close relationship with your professors. I have students that some students are like 20 years older than me, but I call them my kids because we become family. The minute you come into my classroom, it's a very intimate, honest, real environment, and people are going through their own personal issues. They bring that into, the classroom, and we work through all of it together, but we stay together, and I support each of my students going forward. And so it's really a very intimate relationship where the professors, we want you to succeed, and we're going to do everything in our power to not only share different skill sets and insights, but also I share my social capital with my students. I help them refine how they want to lead in the world, because, that's ultimately what the world needs. So I just focus on that rather than focusing on the negative. But I do bring that up in class, and we break down, what is your red line from an ethics and moral perspective. And we talk about it openly, because it is very different depending on where where you were raised and what your values are. And we have to talk about it. You have to know what that line is for you. And the other thing too that's really fun is we actually work on even honing kind of, well, what is your intuition telling you? What is your gut telling you? And why is it giving you this warning signal of something's not right here? And then you ultimately have to make a decision, right? So it's really fascinating in a global environment to unpack these issues. So excellent question. That was a very long answer.
Amazing. No, super interesting. I can actually see we have a question here that I might be able to answer. So the question is, are there any debate clubs at Hult? So yes, we do have a debate club. We have several clubs and societies, ranging from the debate club to the consulting club, the wine club, like any type
of chocolate club.
Yeah, everything you can find at Hult. And if it doesn't exist, you're also very welcome to found your own club. So that's also an opportunity. At the moment, I don't see any other questions. If there's any last minute question you want to have answered, as soon as possible, please post it now in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we're going to answer it. But I think at this point, I already want to say thank you for this incredible session, this super useful topic. It's totally interesting. And yeah, for everyone in the chat, as I said before, a recording of this will be sent to you by email in the next days. And as always, for you to know, we have several different events ranging from webinars, workshops, one-to-one sessions. You can find all of them on hult.edu/events. So I think for now, that's it from our side. Thank you again for your class and for your time, Professor Guittard. And for everyone in the chat, thank you for joining. and hopefully see you soon again.
Thanks for having me, Sarah. And it's great to be with all of you. And please reach out on LinkedIn. And if there's more questions that come later, please reach out anytime. And it's just such a privilege and an honor to be with all of you from literally all over the world. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day wherever you are. And I look forward to staying in touch. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Amazing. Thank you very much. And bye, everyone.